Welcome to the first quarterly meeting of the Logic Consortium. I'm Brenda Clodd, and I'm going to get things rolling. We have a packed agenda today. We've got a special topic speaker, and we're going to give you all an update on all of the work that's been done since the kickoff meeting and the working group meeting. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give everybody an introduction. I'll introduce the special speaker, Chad Thrasher. We'll go ahead. We'll give you some of the takeaways and lessons learned from the first working group meeting. We'll talk about the progress that we've made so far, and we'll give you an idea of what's next. Next slide. So just a few logistical reminders. If you need technical assistance, reach out in the chat. We've got people monitoring that. Any questions that you want, you can put into Slido. You'll see the link showing up in the chat periodically. I also have a slide that you can take the QR code off of. Or you can use the Q&A section of the Zoom webinar. We'll copy those over the Slido so that we can keep that. We are recording this meeting so that it can be posted to the website. It'll probably be a week or so before it gets posted. And as always, if you have any questions about Logic, you can always go to the website, or you can email the team at the Logic email. Next slide, please. So as I said, put any questions, comments, feedback you want into the Slido link. Here is the Slido link, and the event code is Logic-April 2024. Katrina, just leave this up for a second or two so people can get the Slido link. All right, next slide, please. Content reminder, this is an international diverse community. Please be respectful of others as you participate. Please do not put any CUI, export controlled intellectual property, or sponsor sensitive information into the chat or Slido. Also, don't put any protected health information or personally identifiable information out that you're not willing to have the general public see. Next slide, please. Now I want to talk a little bit about some Logic leadership changes. Dan Meidenbauer will be taking over as the APL project manager for Logic, replacing me. Dan has a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from Virginia Tech and 2 master's degrees, one in engineering management and the other in defense and strategic studies from the U.S. Naval War College. He has served as a program manager and a national security strategist here at APL for some time. He's also a dual career professional because he serves in the U.S. Navy Reserves. And so he's looking forward to coming over and doing some systems engineering work and program management for the Space Department. Dan's email is there, so you can always feel free to reach out to contact him. People are probably wondering why the change. So what's up with me is I'm going back to doing technical work as I begin my transition to retirement. I've been at the lab for 40 years. So it's time for me to move into another phase. I'll still be supporting both LSII and Logic. We're doing this transition now so that there's overlap before I actually go out on retirement. And I'm looking forward to seeing everybody at the spring meeting. So I'm not going anywhere. You'll still see me. I'll still be involved. I'm just trying to hand over the leadership reins so that the transition is smooth. Dan, do you want to unmute, turn your camera on, and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Brenda. I just wanted to say I'm really excited to take on supporting this effort. This is a really exciting time to be working this set of problems. I have a heavy background in working standards, and looking forward to working with all of you as we continue to push the envelope of what's possible in this domain.
Thanks, Dan. Next slide, please. So next up, as I just mentioned, I'm looking forward to seeing everybody at the spring meeting. This is a reminder to register for the spring meeting. While in-person is closed, virtual is still open through the end of the week. I encourage everybody to participate, even if you can only do it virtually. There's a lot of really good information about the lunar community. The last half day is all going to be focused on DARPA Luna 10 and Logic. A new thing this year at the spring meeting is going to be a tech demonstration that we're going to do on Wednesday evening. So you'll get to see a lot of the technologies that are actually being developed by a lot of the commercial space companies. So it promises to be a very, very dynamic meeting with a lot of good information. So, you know, again, I encourage you to register virtually if you haven't already. Next slide. So one thing that DARPA has put out recently is another RFI called Shale. This is a direct outgrowth of the Lunar 10 study, and they have identified 6 key areas where they really want to focus on how to accelerate the lunar economy and make improvements in technology. And those areas are thermal management, lunar prospecting, biomanufacturing, increase in refinement rates of low gravity, and new concepts for PNT. White papers are due to DARPA on tax day for those that are here in the US on April 15th. And then they're going to follow that with some seminar meetings the week of April 22nd. More information on it can be found at that link. I encourage you to take a look at it, and if you feel like you have something to contribute, to respond to the RFI. Next slide, please. So now I want to kind of give you a little bit of a recap on the working groups. Right now, we have sort of 4 areas that we're focusing on: power, communications, PNT, and then all of the other stuff that is across all of the focus areas. We put out a call at the working group meeting for community volunteers for the working groups. We did get responses back on that. We're still working through how to kind of organize some of this stuff. We will be doing a reach out. I'll talk a little bit more about that in another slide or two. But I wanted to remind everybody that we do have an APL core team lead for each of the ones that we're working on right now. So Anna Shin is currently the power lead. Jason Arcedo is currently doing communications. Danielle Mortensen is doing PNT. And then Catherine Morris and Christina Burke are providing support for all of the remaining areas. Next slide, please. So part of the reason why we haven't actually closed the loop on the community volunteers and working groups is I really kind of felt like we had to have a better understanding of what the roles and responsibilities would be for both the APL core team as well as for the community leadership that we're trying to put into place. And we kind of had to rethink the roles and responsibilities and how we wanted to do this after we had the first working group meeting, and we had tremendous participation. It was much larger and grander than we had expected it to be. We were expecting this to be a little bit of a smaller, more focused effort. So we're still working on how to do that, because we want to keep the community vibrant and strong, and we want everybody to have the chance to participate. So as far as the APL core team, they're going to be responsible for doing the actual meeting logistics. We'll provide the Zoom rooms and make sure that all of the comm support and everything is in place. We are parsing and analyzing all of the materials that we get from the community, whether that be at working group meetings or quarterlies or through surveys or whatever else. We are actually taking a look at putting all this stuff into a SysML model so that we can maintain an architecture and figure out how to map all of the standards and the pain points and the use cases that we're getting. And we're trying to track progress on where we are, how many gaps we've identified, where the gaps are. All of this is heading in the direction that we have an obligation to do a deliverable and have a leave behind for DARPA of standards recommendations reports, where we can say, these are the standards that are already existing that you can use. These are the ones that we think need to be modified, and these are ones where there's no standards at all. And so we're going to put those reports together in each of the 6 focus areas. We're also serving as a crossover point with the rest of the community for standards and interoperability, because one of the things we heard in the LSII world was how important interoperability and standards are. And so we want to make sure that we're keeping up with the state of the art of technologies and understanding where where standards and interoperability need, or what the interfaces really look like. And then we'll generate all of those recommendation reports for each of the focus areas. Next slide, please. So, further defining the roles and responsibilities for the working group leads, the ones from the community that we're looking to get volunteers for. They'll coordinate with the APL core team on meeting agenda and topics. They'll work at leading the discussions during the working group meetings. We also want them to work at meeting discussions and keeping the community vibrant on Slack in between the meetings so that we don't lose momentum. They'll track any action items or assignments, both that get assigned to the APL core team as well as other members of the working group. We're really looking for them too to help facilitate the resolution of dissenting opinions, right? This is all supposed to be a consensus-driven, community-led effort to come up with standards. I mean, we're really trying to model this after the confers pattern that DARPA was successful with before. So we're trying to make sure that this is really community and commercial focused and not being driven so much by the government. And then we need to have help both with the working group leads as well as the working group members and actually getting the standard recommendation reports put together. For the working group members, we expect them to be active in the community, be active in working group meetings, be active in the quarterlies, be active on Slack, be working some of these action items in between working group meetings. And then, like I said, most of the working group members at some point, we're going to really be looking for people to put pencil to paper and really help us actually get the deliverables out. So next slide, please. So update on the call. We have received a number of responses from interested folks. We now have a better idea of the roles and responsibilities. So we'll be reaching out to those that have already responded to discuss their interest and expectations now that we know kind of what the roles and responsibilities will look like. We do hope to have all of the leads identified for the main working group. It may be that we give some leads a trial run to see how comfortable they are and how well things work out, and then kind of revisit it. We are looking for more than one person, so we can do rotation. This is all volunteer. There is no kind of budget for it. So if you don't end up having the time to do all of it, if we can get people to share the load, that certainly will be very helpful. So if you want to volunteer again, just send an email to the Logic email with your name, who you represent, and kind of why you think you should be in the lead role and kind of what your qualifications are, right? So we can kind of do that. And I particularly want to encourage people in the power area because power is a very broad thing, and there's a lot of different types of power. There's also a lot of different aspects of the power that we're looking for help in. Next slide. All right, now I want to take the opportunity to introduce our speaker. Chad Thrasher is the Interoperability Lead for the Lunar Mars Systems Engineering and Integration Office in ESDMD. He's based at Marshall in Huntsville. He serves as an expert in interoperability and integration, leading analysis focusing on the initial Artemis missions and the near-term evolution of interoperable capabilities for NASA. Chad holds a bachelor's degree in physics and a master's in systems engineering management. He's a recipient of a NASA Silver Snoopy, which I want to know what that looks like, a special service award for his contributions during the return to flight activities, and both the engineer and manager of the year for the local chapter of the International System and Safety Society. So I will turn it over to you, Chad.
Well, thank you, Brenda. I appreciate that a lot. So I am Chad Thrasher. I work for Moon to Mars at NASA Marshall Space Flight Center. I work under the Systems Engineering and Integration group under Moon to Mars. And so today, I just want to talk a little bit about what we've already done on interoperability and what we're working on. And then just kind of the last slide, talk about some of the future possibilities and kind of maybe take off where Brenda left off, right? In asking for people and inputs. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So back in January of 2021, I was asked to start the Interoperability Working Group. And we had representation from all the programs at the time. And we also had a lot of representation from different subject matter experts. So at the time, there was no EHP, there was no HLS. They were in either pre-formulation or some early state. We meet regularly, sometimes for holidays and stuff like that, we don't meet. So we were the first group to define interoperability for what was the Artemis exploration systems, and it's changed a couple of times, and now it's Moon to Mars. And that was based on an early recognition that we needed interoperability to achieve our goals, right? There were some areas where you needed it right away, and then some that you would need it later. But the original interoperability standards focused on facilitating the gateway design, similar to ISS. They had a lot of problems integrating on ISS, and that was to have these standards that they could overcome those problems early and not have them. And then after the gateway rough design was developed, the focus shifted to communications, rendezvous, docking, and power. So as you started looking at Artemis 2 and Artemis 3 and Artemis 4, those were the things that we focused on because we knew we had to communicate. We knew we had to dock major systems together. And so power was the other one that we thought there was a good, maybe a good bang for the buck, good payback on. The other thing we learned really quickly in our analysis was as you look at the initial lunar surface systems, they have to be entirely self-sufficient, at least for the initial missions. And so really your communications and the ability to send and receive signals and data drives interoperability initially. And then later, as those systems become more specialized, we're thinking that allows you to really get some payback on interoperability, especially with the exchange of power and maybe other things. And if you have questions, you can stop me and ask those questions, or you can maybe wait to the end. I'm going to try and give us some time at the end to answer questions. Next slide, please. So what did the Interoperability Working Group cover? Well, we are managing the international interoperability standards. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the Interoperability Working Group's products. So our first major product was a status report, and we've generated that twice, and we're working on a third version. So it communicated to the rest of the Moon to Mars program our results and of our assessments and what capabilities we thought needed to be interoperability and have interoperability and where they were lacking. We identified areas where the mission just did not close. We felt like there was not enough interoperability. In our first version, we really picked on communications and utilization interfaces. And then we also make recommendations or point out where we think interoperability could add either to baseline capability or to a contingency capability. An example of this was, do you want a utilization packet that you could put on LTV or PR, and it would extend the ability to have the time for an EVA in case the LTV broke down or something like that, right? You could recharge the suits in space and then go on. So that was a case of that kind of got thrown out, and now it's coming back. So that was our way of communicating the results of our analysis. And then we also have a watch list. And so the watch list is taking what we found out by the analysis and putting it in a prioritized list. And we use that to kind of keep focus, right? Are we working on the top 10 things? Are we putting effort in the right place? And then we've actually generated some specific documents to address interoperability. We generated the ACD graphical user interface standard and the icon and symbol library. And so that helps set a standard of how the crew will interface with the displays. Things like cautions and warnings not popping up behind other pop-up blocks, right? Having a minimum font size, having the same color mean the same thing in different systems, right? Things like that, so that it just lessens the workload on the crew. If you think about it, a crew is going to be on Orion, and then they're going to be in Gateway, and then they're going to be in HLS, and they might be in the PR on a later mission, and then they have to go back. So every time you have to change them on a slightly different system, you're increasing their training, and you're increasing the probability of them making a minor mistake. And so that's one of the things we identified early on, and we've actually gotten those documents approved and are working on them. And then the other thing is, we reviewed the documents of other programs like PR, like HLS, and we give them feedback early in their formulation phase on, hey, you need, to list the power standard, or you need to list the communication standard that needs to be applicable. Things like that, so that they have in their document standard, and they've got a complete set of requirements when it goes out for review or for request RFP. Next slide, please. Okay, did it refresh?
It's on the interoperability standards overview on my screen.
Okay, so I'm looking at the interoperability standards overview. So we talked about the interoperability standards a little bit earlier in a couple of previous slides. Here are the 9 standards, and it's got their full title and just a real short summary of what's in each one of them. And then I have some notes on the far right. As you can see, the power standard has gone through Rev A, and the COM standard is, Rev B is in approval right now. They had some comments and they've resolved those, and they're going to board approval, I think, at the end of the month. You also see there's 3 that are blank, which means that we don't envision an update. That the groups that generated those standards think they're complete. Then you see there's 2 that have possible updates. So those are the ones where, yeah, we could have a update. It would be minor. It wouldn't be a major update. And then we have 2 where we know we really need updates in those documents, and possibly even another document. And at the bottom, you can see the status of each one. I'll just point out that for the COM standard, there's a couple of TBXs they've got left that they've got to resolve. For the power standard, we know at some point we're going to have a transmission voltage and an associated power quality put in that. Right now, we've only got 28 volts DC and 120 volts DC. And then the external robotic interface standard, right now it's all microgravity LEO, and we need something for the lunar surface. So that's going to be a major section that needs to be added. And then there are some minor updates to the IDD, that's the docking system standard. And we may even add either a new section or a new document for a lunar docking system standard. Haven't decided that yet, but it's being discussed. And then I've given that link to the interoperability standards. That's also a public page there. If you want to copy that and look at them, there's PDFs out there available. That page is going through, going to be revised based on some NASA cybersecurity rules, but we're going to try and maintain that page, and that page has a place where you can make comments or enter questions, or you can even suggest other things that other standards that you need. So that's another way to get input back to NASA. Next slide, please. Oh, so what have we learned? So programs beginning at different times causes a problem, but it's really necessary. Orion, SLS, and EGS were started very early. And so the Orion systems and the information systems on Gateway, you have to kind of bridge those a little bit. There's a little bit of difference, and you have to take that account when you're developing the standard. So sometimes it's really hard to levy a standard on heritage hardware. You get a lot of pushback when you try to do that. So that's why you want to work with them during formulation to get those standards in there. It also means you have to write the standards at a high level, which allows like the minimum commonality, allows interoperability, and then you have to let them develop the rest of that for their particular system. There is a cost for interoperability, right? So if you add if you add interoperability in general, it adds mass, volume, time, and funding. And so we really have to buy our way in to drive interoperability. And how do you do that? You use use cases. And the more detailed your use cases are, the better you can make your arguments, right? One of the problems we're having is we've only got use cases and con ops for the first few missions, and that kind of prevents us from having the justification for those missions that are like Artemis 8, 9, or 10, right? And another lesson we've learned is using a commercial, military, or other standard is cheaper than making your own and maintaining it. And just for example, the ingress protection ratings, IP ratings, and the CCSDS standards are referenced in the CCSDS standard is referenced in the COM section now, standard and the avionics standard, I think, or the software standard. The IP standard has been put in some SRDs, and it's just easier, right? It's an existing standard. Just use the existing standard. And then one thing that I've learned by running this team, the IOWG, is the value of communication and diversity. And what I mean by that is to do a really comprehensive analysis, you've got to work with multiple programs and multiple disciplines. Everybody's seen the problem from their knothole, and having those people, having a lot of different people look at it with a lot of different backgrounds is really helpful. The other thing is you've got to develop an environment where everybody is engaged, willing to ask questions, and willing to provide inputs. And we've been fairly successful at that, to the point where we've actually had groups that weren't initially involved in the IOWG come to me and say, I want to tell you what kind of problem we've got. And sometimes we can help them. Sometimes it's within scope. Sometimes it's not within scope. But we usually try to provide some help, either if it's in scope, we take it on as a problem, or if it's not within scope, we can provide them with contacts. Our group is broad enough that we usually know at least one or two experts in the area, and that's really helpful to whoever comes to you with a problem. And then when you've got a question about their area, they're willing to really help you when you go back and ask them questions. So next slide, please. Did it change? Slide 7?
Yep.
Okay. So in the Moon to Mars architecture definition document, which is a public document, it's out there. There's a recurring tenet number 7, interoperability collaboration. I ended up authoring that. And the quote in there, I'll let you read, but it's just focusing on coordination and cooperation between all the established and the emerging actors, right? And so there's not only countries and new academic groups participating, there's also individual organizations out there participating. And so, you know, through partnership and collaboration is reflected in the architecture, right? And so we've got that first slide where we show some of the initial pieces we've identified: HLS, a pressurized rover, LTV, a couple of crew members doing some scientific things on the utilization activities on the surface. If you'll hit return, please. Okay, I'm not seeing that. Yeah, there you go. The next slide is maybe what some people in the STMD or SMD group may see, where they've got more robotics that are automated, almost fully automated, or at least you send a command and they build a certain thing, they clear a certain area, and you've got one astronaut controlling several robotic groups. And next slide, next return, please. And then you've got kind of the final, you know, what we might envision at the end, right? You've got your orbiting gateway, and you've got multiple communication satellites, and you've got all these different specialized facilities, and you've got separate power generation, and you've got crewed astronauts and a robotic presence working together on the moon. And so my question about the future, and what I would like the conversation to kind of, or help Brenda with the conversation and the others, is what is your vision? And describe your use case. And then if you will hit return a couple times, I'll just go through a couple questions or bullet points under that. What systems are involved in your use case? How many people? What types of capabilities, functions, and technologies do you need? What are the minimum capabilities that you need to make your use case close, right? And then here's one that's really important. Can you describe the evolution from the current planned missions to your use case? So how do you get from what's on the books right now to where you want to be? And then I think if you'll hit return a couple more times. So, and what makes it either scientifically, technically, or financially compelling, right? So it's got to be one of those things that it's worth investing all this time, effort, and money for one of those 3 reasons. And I would be really interested in some of the financial reasons, right? Because that's what's really going to drive habitation, long-term habitation on the moon. And finally, write it down. That allows you to make it clear and identify all the pieces and parts and get feedback on it. And so with that, does anyone have any questions? And I think that's my next slide.
Kristen, I thought we had 1 or 2 standards questions for Chad about the CCSDS, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Yep. We do have some questions in the Slido. So let's see. So Chad, for our first question from Jorge, what other standards organizations participate in the conversations with you?
So what we really have right now is we have experts at NASA that have worked on these interoperability standards with their counterparts at other international partner space agencies. They are generally members of their own group, right? So AIAA or, you know, whatever professional group you may belong to, right? So there might be thermal engineers or mechanical engineers. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to get a broader feedback on that. And we're trying to reach out to what does industry and what does academia see for these? Are these standards what they need? Or is there something that they're not answering the mail on that we've got a hole that we don't see, right? And we go back to standards cost money. So if there's another standard that already exists in the commercial world or in the military world and we can use that, then let's go ahead and use those. Generally, we might use those, but we might have to modify them.
Thanks, Chad.
Hey,
So we
Chad, and let me interrupt for just a second. We've had a number of people ask if we can put your contact information out. So can we put your email out to the community?
Yeah. You may just type that in the chat.
Yes, if you could, that would be very helpful. Go ahead, Kristen. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no problem. So there are a few more technical questions. So there was one, what does ingress protection mean? Is it for electrical, moisture, dust, radiation, etc.? And are there different standards for different types of intrusions or leaks?
So the ingress protection standard is 2 numbers, and it's been a while since I read it, but typically it'll have a number like 55 or 65 or 66. And one is for solids and one is for liquids. And so it has a prescribed test method for each level. And as long as you pass, you can take your system and put it under that test, you can show that you meet that protection level. Basically, a 65 is dust of a certain size will not get into the device, and a liquid at a certain pressure that is cascaded on your system from multiple areas will not get into your system, right? And then you get up to the higher numbers, and it's, you know, effective up to submerging in so many feet of water or so many pounds of pressure, right? And so that's, you can do IP ratings and on the web and find that information.
All right, with that, I think we're going to actually transition to the next part of our talk. So I'm going to turn things over to Jason. I'd like to thank Chad for giving his presentation. Chad, I encourage you to take a look at the questions that have come up in the Q&A and in Slido. And we posted Chad's email address to the chat, so you can email him directly with questions. So Jason's now going to talk about the key takeaways from the first working group. So take it away, Jason.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jason Arcedo. I'm a systems engineer for APL. I'm here to talk about the common themes, takeaways from our first working group meeting we held of March in this year. We had a prioritization on power and comms and PNT. Unfortunately, due to the time that we had to present, we focused primarily on power, and we kind of identified sort of how we're going to discuss and intake sort of inputs from the community itself. Power will go into the other slide, but again, I want to iterate the emphasis we have is on the perspective of non-government use cases and inputs. The intent is to sort of identify the infrastructure and interoperability standards utilized by commercial and private users. And this is sort of the loose relationship between what Chad presented earlier on sort of finding these already identified and defined standards. You know, we realize that our focus areas are building blocks for overlapping services usage that might be beyond our scope of control. And we are looking into handling the needs identified by the community as we go along. So in doing so, we want to acknowledge sort of the call for standards that address for testing, reliability, manufacturing, maintenance, radiation, materials, and all topics listed in that first hashtag on the third bullet. We do want to understand how to handle use cases that span between multiple focus areas. We know that a lot of people utilize specific services or plug into certain services or infrastructures. And we want to account for how to handle multiple mission operations, the usage of scaling and scalability with high numbers and sharing common resources and transactional activities was kind of identified. And we'll sort of address that earlier. We do also want to determine sort of the broader scope of a parametric system model to help model and understand those resource demands identified in the earlier bullet. I do want to take a step back to acknowledge that we've had a lot of participation. We used mirror boards activities to set that up, and the community was very active and enthusiastic about using those tools. Next slide, please. So we have some common themes and takeaways, and this is specifically towards the power inputs that we had. This table right here is organized on sort of the number of interactions that we received during the activities of the March working group, the top having the higher amount of activity, and we progressed forwards. We had lots of inputs, and these were sort of, again, the common themes and takeaways that we had. Since inputs were mostly anonymous, some of the discussion could be based on specific entities' enthusiasm for the topic, but that doesn't take away how much information we gathered from contributors at that time. So in the first part, we needed to, or there was a call where it asked to have a lot more detail in our usage or visualization. There's a need for representation of hierarchies, and these specific, oh geez, my screen is flaking on me. Sorry. Risk and reliability standards and fault management for various scenarios was a topic that was brought up, not just in power and control, but as the interaction between users of the system and not just the system itself. Thermoregulation was a topic. Survive the night was a common theme of how to address that technically. Operational considerations that we needed to address. And power beaming itself was a surprise focus to not just us, but sort of our DARPA sponsor as to the interest of the community itself and sort of identifying standards and usage on that. But most of these topics that were introduced and takeaways, we are still analyzing them, and we're going to take them into the next working group discussions. Don't want to dwell too much time on the technical aspects of it. But we did want to point out that the community contributions were essential to this. So the next slide, please. Nope. Okay, I thought it was me. All right, so from our first discussion, we had a few lessons learned, and this is an iterative process. We are trying to learn how to work with the community and sort of educate both ourselves as to how to intake information and address, the needs of the community itself when we're doing this lunar environment. Our initial objectives itself were to sort of collect inputs from community. We provided the tools for it. We introduced mirror board. Like I said, there was a lot of participation there, and we're still analyzing all the inputs from there. The diagramming, we used I won't say a standard. We used a notional way of drawing and capturing diagrams, and we're using those in the activities that are on the mirror board. Dr. Catherine Morse, who's coming up after me, will sort of help describe methods for us to best capture any inputs and sort of help the community for us to understand sort of their needs itself. So the strength of our activity, again, was because of the community participation. We had a lot of inputs. There are certain areas, specialties, and areas of interest that we've identified that we're going to go through. Essentially, we wanted to understand how do you intend to, what is your service and how do you intend to use it in the lunar environment? Or what is the service that you would need to conduct business on the moon, and help us sort of identify any standards that make that possible. The call for community support is to bring upon SMEs to sort of help focus our discussion and sort of prioritize any kind of technical needs, or sort of fast track any development as they progress outside of the government entities. And let me see. So our Slido polls related to lessons learned in future meetings, that's on the, is that poll up, Kristen?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay.
The link, if you don't have it, is in the chat. Thanks.
Yep. As I said, any sort of community inputs we'll take into learning as we prepare for our next working group, which is in comms, and also any follow-up discussions with the power working group. Next slide, please. Following me is Dr. Catherine L. Morse. She's in charge of helping us sort of parse through all of the inputs for standard submissions from the community. And she's going to discuss sort of, I guess, the methods and mechanisms for us to intake and communicate with you guys where we're at. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. So before I go over our status with the standards, I want to thank our guest speaker, Chad Thrasher, for really setting me up here, because he made a couple points that as I'll just say a standards wonk, because this is where I live, that I really appreciated. The first, and it's something that people in the standards business say over and over again. He said, using existing standards is cheaper than creating your own, or maybe he said it was easier, but both of those things are true. So definitely we're focused on what standards there are out there now. I'll just remind folks that our approach for this is going to be first adopt, second adapt if we can't adopt, and third only author if we can neither adopt nor adapt. So thanks for teeing that up, Chad. I also want to say he hit pretty hard, or at least it just sounded like that to me, because you hear what you want to hear, but he talked about working use cases and documentation, and that's what our standards effort here is going to be all about. So in the figuring out what we're going to use, we have started collecting standards. So there was some initial information we had where there was a lot of information that we got from the kickoff meeting, and I've begun parsing and categorizing them. Of course, this is going to be an ongoing effort. So to date, we have 16 power standards identified. I believe that Brenda and the team are working on getting this information on our external website so you can see it. There is one suggestion from the kickoff meeting that needs additional detail, but also I will say, as you will see on the bottom bullet, there are several standard suggestions from the March meeting that still need to be crosswalked with the current list to see whether we've had them, if we already had them, or research for necessary details. So if you think there should be more, there should be larger numbers on this list, you're absolutely right. For comms and PNT, we have 93, but 84 of those, and I know there was a question earlier about CCSDS, there are 84 on that list, and we need to walk through those and figure out which actually need to be evaluated in detail, because there are so many of them. We've also had a suggestion about the third generation partnership project, And it's been identified as an organization, but there were no specific standards identified, which brings me to my bumper sticker, and I'll come back to the rest of this. But when you provide standards inputs, please, if you know off the top of your head some of the details, please provide those and or provide your contact information so we can follow up. Because in the cases where we got, say, the actual identifier for a standard, so the standards organization and the number, the standards organization's specific identifier, those are easy to track down. It gets trickier after that. So just everything you know, just please provide it. It'll speed up the process. Even though we're not initially focusing on robotics and construction, mobility, ISRU, and mining, we still have a few in those categories. In fact, Chad also discussed the deep space interoperability standards. So we've parsed those, and I think they're in all of the categories. So at least one in those three categories I just mentioned are from the deep space interoperability standards. The other thing that we discovered in the course of parsing the inputs is that although we didn't originally have a focus area for software engineering, systems engineering, testing, and simulation, those arose from the inputs received during the kickoff meeting. And so now we're tracking those as well. And there are quite a few of those, as you can see. Next slide, please. So what are we going to do with all these standards? How are we going to figure out whether to adopt, adapt, or author? And we also did this at the kickoff meeting. We're using certain gap identification techniques. We picked pain points, scenarios and use cases, and user stories. So pain points are, I like to say, things that keep you awake at night. Scenarios and use cases, well, we've already touched on use cases in Chad's briefing, but these are descriptions or narratives of something that has to happen. You can, and then user stories, you can think of user stories as maybe vignettes within a scenario or use case. And they usually have the form that as a role, I need the following to happen so that I can perform a task. So you can see how if you strung a whole bunch of those together, you could get to something that would look like a scenario or a use case. So I find it interesting that we have a lot of pain points. So that tells us we have work to do. We have several scenarios and use cases, and there are several use case suggestions from the March meeting that still need to be transcribed. And these gap identifications are in various stages of completion. So some of them we just have names. Some of them we have a lot of questions. So there was a brief statement of the use case, and there are a lot of questions. But we're going to come back to the questions in just a couple slides here, because questions are not necessarily bad at this point. I do want to say these are all going to be excellent analysis opportunities for mapping standards. So I'm going to talk next about performing the analysis to get to those adopt, adapt, author decisions or recommendations. I do want to say one thing about the types of techniques we're using for gap identification. As we're getting them, it's becoming clear that, of course, there's an intersection between these. And so going forward, what we're going to do is we're going to take the pain points and the user stories and map them to the scenarios and use cases. That'll do a couple things. That'll get all of the gap identification goodness we have organized in logical compartments. It will also reduce the number of things that we need to track, because if we wind up with hundreds across these three types of identification inputs, we're going to have a hard time keeping track of them. But I also think mostly it's that they have logical relationships, and we should keep those logical relationships together. It'll make the analysis make more sense. So speaking of analysis, if I could have my next slide, please. Okay, so here's some examples out of Power. Now, I want to make clear the goal here today is not to start this analysis. It's to start people thinking about it, because we're going to be doing more of this going forward in breakout sessions. So So these are the pain points that we have for power. These are a few of them. And so you can see that there's sort of a primary idea, and then particularly, for example, with microgrids, I guess this came up quite a bit at the last meeting where I wasn't present. There are some subcategories of why microgrids are challenging. So these are the sorts of things that we'll integrate into the use case for power. So here's one of the use cases, which is wireless power transmission. But there are questions, for example, over what distance? Is it feasible over the desired distance? What about interference with other electrical devices? And how does the physics of the moon change the efficacy of this? Now, I will just say, I understand that practically everybody here, except for me, thinks about these things, particularly things like the physics of the moon being different than the physics of the Earth, more than I do, because I come out of the DoD community. But there are these things that are unique to non-terrestrial applications. So that's, I think, going to probably be a large part of what we have to consider as we're looking at standards going forward. So, full disclosure, I swiped this slide from Anna because it's a really good way of talking about how we're going to do analysis. So we've got on the left our power system of systems, right? There are these different, I'll say capabilities. Maybe they're not all completely separate in a system of systems sense. But you can see that Anna has mapped the first list of standards. They're more on the list now, but the first list of standards to these systems in this system of systems. And I'll point out two things that are going to be really important as we go forward. The first is that there's something interesting happening with Zoom. Okay. The first is that every single one of these boxes, every single one of these systems has multiple standards aligned with it now. So the question is, do all of those make sense? Because they could be different aspects of the problem, but maybe they're conflicting standards. So we'll need to sort that out. The other thing is, at least right now, they're aligned with the systems, not necessarily the interfaces between the systems, right? And interfaces between systems, or interoperability, is going to be a huge part of what we do going forward. So keep that in mind as we go to my last slide, please. Okay, so some sample analytical questions to be answered. And part of what we're going to do when we first start doing this in earnest is we're going to develop more analytical questions, but this is just to give you a sense of how we're going to go about the process. So are the gaps addressed by the standards already identified in the preceding slide? So if we look at all our gaps, our use cases, pain points, and scenario and user stories, which are again all going to be consolidated, are those answered by the standards that are there? Because if they're not answered by the standards that are there, that's a sign to us that we need to proceed from adopt to adapt or author. And are new standards required? So thinking more now about the interfaces between the systems in our system of systems, are new standards required, especially for negotiation processes between, say, the stages in the system of systems on the preceding slide, or different systems in the system of systems within the same stage? So you could have, for example, under power generation, Anna's aligned 6 existing standards. Do we need to worry about the fact that there might be conflicts between those? And of course, once again, identifying those conflicts means figure out, do we adopt one of those standards, or are multiple applicable, but we still need to adapt? We might need to author some standards to do interoperability. But once again, reflecting on what Chad said, using existing standards is cheaper and easier than creating new ones. So that will be key to our process. So that's the end of my presentation, and I believe Danielle is up after me.
Yeah, hi everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Hopefully you can hear me okay. So I'm here to talk about what's next. I promise I only have one slide. I know it's a couple minutes past the hour. So our next working group meeting is going to be May 14th at 1 p.m. Eastern, and we're going to continue on our topics of position navigation, timing, communications, and power. And we have some logistical updates for you. So we're going to be lengthening our meeting to 90 minutes because obviously an hour is not enough for us to all talk and get our information and all our thoughts on the same page. So we'll be going from 1 p.m. to 2:30 p.m. Eastern, with the first 30 minutes being a special topic, which we'll have everyone in the same room talking about the same thing. And then the next 60 minutes will be breakout rooms for each different focus area. So the power breakout session is going to build on the inputs that they gathered during their first working group meeting back in March. And then our communications and P&T groups will be kind of beginning their baseline discussions and doing some high-level block diagrams, standards mapping, all that good stuff that we did for power back in March. We also wanted to put a plug in here for our Logic Slack. So we only have 31 members on the Logic Slack page at the moment, and I think we have over like 800 people in our consortium. So there's a huge gap there. And once our working groups are up and running, this is going to be how we communicate with everyone on a day-to-day basis. So if you're able to send an email to logic@jhuapl.edu, we can get you signed up and in the same boat for our external Slack messaging system. But in all, we're really excited to start the analytical work of all the inputs that we've been gathering as of right now. Kristen has just put in the chat that the closing poll is now open in Slido. So if you can hop on that and make sure you answer those couple questions, that'll be great feedback for us to provide to you the best that we can provide to you. And I think with that, we're flipping over to a couple questions, Q&A with Kristen. So off to you.
Hello, everyone. Chad, if you are still around and open to taking questions, there's a few more for you. So let me know by turning your camera on. But I will start with the first question. It's addressed to both Catherine and Chad. Is there a visual risk index where risk is more likely to emerge on the colony? I'm assuming it's on the moon, so that astronaut quarters and critical components can be situated away from higher risk geographies. Thank you.
Looks like Chad has dropped off. So,
Oh,
Catherine, I think that's going to be yours to answer.
okay, so you said, I missed the first few words. Is there a risk? Sorry, say again.
A visual risk index for where we're going to be placing things on the moon, such as critical infrastructure where people live.
Okay, so I understand the question. Once again, remember, I'm a standards wonk, not a lunar expert. But I will say the following thing, which is that in all systems engineering endeavors, there are, there is risk analysis. Risk analysis is very important. So, and I think we've all seen the stoplight charts about that, cross-reference likelihood and severity of outcome. So it's an interesting idea. I'm trying to form a picture in my head of what this would look like, but I could see doing something like a visual map. There's a serious amount of engineering to go into that based on what the risks of particular other installations are. And so the range of the physical range of the risk, the likelihood of the risk, and the severity of the outcome. So I guess my short answer is not that I know of so far, but I think it's a good idea, and I can sort of come up with a visualization in my head that might make sense.
Great, thanks, Catherine. Let's take a look at the next question. Maybe I'll just open up the floor to anyone who can answer these questions. So, is there an interoperability standard for life support systems?
Yes, and there was actually an answer put into that from Chad before he left. It was in the chat, so I think that actually got answered in the webinar chat.
Okay, thank you.
But you'll have to catch it because I did see it scroll by, but I didn't pull it out.
Okay, same. All right, thanks for that. A general standards question. Is there a hierarchy priority node, a point of standards as you move from one system to another?
I think that actually ties very nicely into the question that was asked before. So one of the things that I think is going to have to play out in this, and this is an interesting takeaway from today's meeting for sure, is I think there's going to be sort of priorities to some of this stuff, because I think human safety is always going to trump everything else. So any standards that are involved in protecting the astronauts when they are on the moon or others will always trump any other one. So they would end up being the ones that would kind of take precedence in an ordering of standards, and almost have to make sure that you have to make sure that you're not your standards aren't in conflict, and that you sort of set a priority order for the ones that address the most critical risks. Do you have other questions?
Brenda, there's a question in the chat about how to join Slack. There is no link. If you would like to join the Slack, please email us at our email address, logic@jhuapl.edu. And I've dropped that in the chat. I'm sorry for the beeping. People are emailing me about joining Slack, which is very exciting.
Well, I think since we're at quarter after, I'm gonna probably pause it here. I do want to apologize for all of the technical difficulties. Normally this runs very smoothly. I don't know whether or not the issues are Zoom related, or whether they're related to just network issues that we're having here at APL. I'm not 100% sure. We will work through these, and hopefully the next time we won't see a lot of the same issues that we saw today with a lot of the slide projections and wonkiness that some of us saw when we were presenting. So again, I apologize for the technical issues. A lot of people are trying to blame it on the eclipse. I don't think it was the eclipse, but who knows? Could be. And so I want to thank everybody again for their participation in the quarterly. Again, a reminder that we'll have a working group meeting next month. And at that one, you'll see a lot more work outside of power. We're going to add comms and PNT and try a little bit different format to see if we can start trying to do a lot more things in parallel. And depending upon how that comes out, we will start to work on some of the other topic areas. I know there's a lot of people interested in the market analysis and the mobility areas, as well as ISRU. So we will phase those in at some point. Right now we're just trying to get our get a operating pattern that seems to work with this size of the community. So we will post all of the slides and the video for this in a week or two. Chad we still have to wait on public release for Chad's materials, and I'd rather just wait until we get that before we post everything. And as always, if you have questions, feel free to mail the Logic email address. And we will see everybody at the L6 Spring meeting or at the next monthly working group. Thanks again, everybody.